When people think of the children of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, they almost always picture the lost princes, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, the boys who vanished into the Tower and became one of the great mysteries of English history. Their story has been retold endlessly, painted in tragedies, whispered in conspiracy theories, and debated in history books and Facebook groups and YouTube comments and Reddit threads for centuries. Well, I guess not the last part for centuries, but you get the point. The truth is, though, that Edward and Elizabeth were not just the parents of two doomed sons and one daughter who became the Queen of England. They were astonishingly prolific, and their household was filled with daughters. Girls who, unlike their brothers, lived long enough to leave their mark on the dynastic chessboard of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. These sisters carried the blood of the House of York into the Tudor world. One would become queen, the mother of the Tudor dynasty itself. Others married into powerful families like the Howards and the Courtenays, planting Yorkist claims that would trouble Henry VIII decades later. One became a nun, another died before her story even really began. Together, they shaped the survival and the transformation of the Yorkist identity after Bosworth in ways that are often overlooked. So last time we talked about the sisters of Edward IV. Today we are talking about the daughters, the princesses who lived in the shadow of their lost brothers, but who carried the Yorkist blood forward into England's future. And to understand their stories, we need to start with the extraordinary family of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, the family that they built and the moment that everything changed, the death of the king in 1483, and the frightened queen retreating with her daughters into sanctuary. Hello, friend, and welcome to the Renaissance English History Podcast, a part of the Agora Podcast Network. I am, as always, delighted that you are here with me today, and we are going to talk about the children, the daughters of Edward IV. Just a quick welcome to some of the newest YouTube members. There have been a number of YouTube members. Of course, YouTube members get extra content. We do author chats just like patrons. So whichever is easiest for you. But if you're listening to this on YouTube, you might join on YouTube. All kinds of fun stuff. So welcome to Life is a Novel, to Mary, to Mitchell, Anna, Jay. I just see your first initial, so I don't know your whole name. Jen, Allie, Jackie, Scarlett, Helen, Stephanie, and Maminia. I hope I didn't butcher that too much. Thank you so very, very much for your support. Of course, you can learn more just by clicking join this channel if you are listening on YouTube. All right, let's get into it. Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville had one of the most prolific royal marriages of the late 15th century. Between 1466 and 1480, Elizabeth gave birth to 10 children who survived infancy, along with several others who died young. In an age when child mortality was expected, the fact that so many of the Yorkist children grew past the dangerous early years was striking. Even more unusual was the number of daughters who lived into adolescence or adulthood. While kings typically relied on a few daughters to cement alliances, Edward and Elizabeth found themselves with a veritable nursery of princesses. Elizabeth, Mary, Cecily, Anne, Catherine, Bridget, and Margaret of York represented an extraordinary dynastic resource. Each girl carried the prestige of the House of York and could have been used to tie England more closely to France, Spain, Scotland, or the powerful noble families within England. At the height of Edward IV's reign, when he appeared very secure on his throne, these daughters would have been considered valuable pawns in the international marriage market. They were raised with this in mind, dressed finely, schooled in languages, music, piety, all the things. Their futures were expected to reinforce the Yorkist dynasty. Now, that expectation collapsed in 1483. That's when Edward IV died suddenly in April. His heir was just 12 years old. Elizabeth Woodville, now widowed and vulnerable, gathered her daughters and her younger son Richard and fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. The image of the Queen and her children and a handful of servants huddled behind the thick abbey walls captures just how precarious the family's position had become. Now, inside sanctuary, the girls' lives were turned upside down. They had been raised in royal palaces, surrounded by attendants and tutors and lavish entertainments. And suddenly they were confined in the dim, echoing spaces of the abbey. Now, look, they had a nice place to live. It's not like they were living in like a dungeon or something like that. But it certainly wasn't having the run of the castle, and they had to stay within the walls to keep under sanctuary. I actually did a video, I don't know, a couple of months ago about what that sanctuary actually meant. So I will put a link to that. Anyway, they were living under the protection of the church, but cut off from the outside world. The younger girls were still children, and their mother had to cope with their fear as rumors circulated about the fate of their brothers. It was here that the once glittering Yorkist nursery became a household under siege. The Italian observer Dominic Mancini, writing in 1483, described Elizabeth Woodville's plight vividly. He noted her sudden retreat into sanctuary with her daughters and youngest son, writing that she was terrified by Richard's seizure of power and sought safety in the abbey, placing herself and her children under the protection of the church. Now, his account talked about the atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that the queen, who was once surrounded by magnificence, was now reduced to anxiety and suspicion, cut off from her allies while Richard consolidated his rule. Mancini's account is stark, but he gives us a sense of how contemporaries understood her fall. The Yorkist princesses, once destined to be queens and duchesses, were now huddled in fear with their mother, while their uncle Richard seized the throne as Richard III. This was the time that they became bargaining chips in a world where their very survival was no longer guaranteed. So let's start with Elizabeth of York. She was born in 1466, the eldest child of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. From the moment of her birth, she was valuable, not because she might one day inherit the throne. Of course, as a girl, she wasn't expected to do that, but because her hand in marriage could be used to secure alliances. Edward IV treated her as a political asset, and he raised her for a future that would bind Yorkist power to one of Europe's great houses. In 1475, when she was just 9 years old, she was formally betrothed to the French Dauphin Charles as part of a peace treaty between Edward and Louis XI of France. This arrangement promised a glittering future, Elizabeth as Queen of France, her children ruling the most powerful kingdom in Europe. But the match was abandoned a few years later as shifting politics and the French hesitation left the young princess once again unpromised. Her prospects grew murkier after her father's death in 1483. With Richard III seizing the throne and her brothers locked away in the Tower, Elizabeth suddenly found herself at the center of a dynastic rumor. There were whispers that Richard, recently widowed, might marry her himself. Now, such a union would have been shocking. He was both her uncle and the man many suspected of disposing of her brothers. But it shows just how essential Elizabeth's body was to the political fate of England. By marrying her, Richard could have solidified his grip on the throne, uniting the Yorkist claim in himself. The marriage never happened. He actually had to come out publicly and deny rumors that he was even thinking about it. But the very possibility, the fact that we even talk about this, shows that her personal fate was seen as inseparable from the kingdom's. Instead, Elizabeth's destiny was decided in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth. Henry Tudor's victory over Richard left him a king with a very shaky claim. His legitimacy came not from his Lancastrian blood, which was not a lot, but from his ability to marry Elizabeth of York. Now, he didn't like to think of it that way and had himself crowned before he married her, but their union in January 1486 symbolically healed the Wars of the Roses. The Red Rose of Lancaster with the White Rose of York joined in the Tudor Rose. For Henry, Elizabeth was the keystone that transformed him from a usurper into a dynastic founder. As Queen, Elizabeth did not dominate her husband's government, but she played a crucial role as the dynastic anchor of the new regime. Chroniclers talked about her as gentle, pious, charitable. She was this perfect late medieval queen. She gave generously to religious houses. She was remembered for interceding on behalf of petitioners, and several surviving accounts note her reputation for mercy. People would appeal to her when they felt that the king's justice was too harsh. She seems to have acted as a softer counterbalance to Henry's severity, a role many queens consort were expected to perform. Elizabeth was also, of course, central to the ceremonial life at court. She presided over all of the entertainments, including the tournaments and the pageants that reinforced the Tudor legitimacy. Her presence in courtly spectacle reminded audiences that the Tudors were joined to the House of York. We know she enjoyed dancing and music and storytelling, and she fostered these entertainments as part of her queenship. In that way, she helped to create a courtly culture that her son Henry VIII would later expand to even grander proportions. Now, how she felt about all of this and doing all of this for the Tudors, no one has, thought to ask her or write that down. One can imagine she had mixed feelings about it. But her greatest contribution to all of this was her children. Elizabeth bore Henry 7 children, though only 4 survived to adulthood. Arthur, the firstborn, was raised as the heir, but he died young in 1502. Henry, Duke of York, became Henry VIII. Margaret Tudor married James IV of Scotland, uniting the Tudor line with the Scottish royal family, a union that would eventually bring the Scottish Stuarts to the English throne. And then Mary Tudor married the French king, Louis XII, briefly becoming the Queen of France before returning to England, marrying Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk. Through these marriages, Elizabeth's children carried their Yorkist blood into nearly every corner of European royalty. Elizabeth's death in February 1503 was sudden and devastating. She had gone into confinement to deliver a daughter, Catherine, but both mother and child died. She was only 37. She actually died on her birthday. Accounts of Henry VII's reaction reveal a rare glimpse of him as a grieving husband rather than just the calculating monarch. Chroniclers record that he shut himself away for days, refusing to eat or be comforted, and he wore mourning for months. For a king known for his control and his reserve, his visible anguish shows just how central Elizabeth had been to his reign. Elizabeth of York went from being a child bride promised to France to the pawn in her uncle's ambitions to the dynastic keystone of the Tudor monarchy, and her queenship gave Henry VII the legitimacy that he needed. Her children linked England to Scotland and to France, and if the princes in the Tower represent the lost future of York, Elizabeth of York represents its survival. Next up, Cecily. Cecily of York was born in 1469. She was the second daughter of Edward and Elizabeth Woodville. As the younger sister to Elizabeth of York, she carried also strong dynastic value in this world where royal daughters were prized for the allegiances that they could form. And early in her life, her prospects, just like Elizabeth, seemed glittering. One of the first marriage negotiations attached to her name was a proposed match with James, Duke of Rothesay, the heir to James III of Scotland. If the union had gone forward, Cecily would have become the Queen of Scotland, binding the houses of York and Stuart together, something that would later happen with her niece, her sister Elizabeth's daughter, Margaret, like we just said, who married into Scotland. Anyway, the treaty negotiations that followed Edward's victory at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471 included the idea of sealing a peace with Scotland through her marriage. Now, it never came to pass. Like everything, there were shifting politics, Scottish hesitation, but the very fact that the proposal was even made shows again how central Cecily's marriage was to Yorkist diplomacy. After her father's death and the fall of her brothers, Cecily's prospects narrowed. By the early 1480s, while she was still a teenager, she was married to Ralph Scrope of Marsham, a relatively minor northern nobleman. The Scropes were an old and loyal Yorkist family, but Ralph himself was far from the sort of prince or magnate one might have expected for a daughter of Edward IV. Some historians believe the match may have been made under Richard III's short reign, binding Cecily to a loyal retainer of his. When Henry VII came to the throne in 1485, this marriage was annulled. The official reasoning is murky, but it likely shows Henry's effort to house clean Yorkist connections. He had zero interest in seeing a daughter of Edward IV securely tied to an old Yorkist family. Instead, he directed Cecily into a new match with John Wells, Viscount Wells. Wells was not only a trusted supporter of Henry, but also his step-uncle, the son of Margaret Beaufort's second husband. For Henry, the marriage tethered Cecily firmly to the Tudor circle, ensuring that she could be watched and her loyalties contained. Cecily and John Wells seem to have had a respectable marriage, though their two daughters died young. Wells himself died in 1499, leaving Cecily a wealthy widow. It was after this that she made the decision that scandalized the court. Without the king's permission, she married a Lincolnshire squire named Thomas Kyme. For a princess of the blood to marry so far beneath her rank and to do it secretly was an unmistakable act of defiance. Henry VII was furious. He confiscated much of her property and banished her from court. The couple retreated to Kyme's estates in Lincolnshire, where they lived quietly, far from the royal stage. We don't know very much at all about Cecily's later years. She occasionally appeared in records as a witness or a benefactor, but for the most part, she disappeared into the obscurity of provincial life. For a woman who had once been floated as the Queen of Scotland, her fate was pretty extraordinary. A Yorkist princess reduced to the life of a country gentlewoman, remembered more for her scandalous marriage than for political triumphs. But she had a bloodline that ensured that she could never entirely escape notice. So now let's talk about Anne of York. So Anne of York was born in 1475. She was the fifth daughter of Edward and Elizabeth. Unlike her elder sisters, Elizabeth and Cecily, who were caught up in international marriage plans and dynastic maneuverings, her story was quieter. Though she did have some international opportunities, as a child she was briefly betrothed to Philip of Austria, the son of Maximilian of Habsburg, the emperor, and the stepson of Margaret of York, her powerful aunt in Burgundy. The negotiations were ambitious, tying the Yorks to the Habsburg dynasty, but they lapsed after her father's death, after Edward's death. Under Richard III, new plans emerged. In 1484, he formally promised that his nieces would be married to men of noble birth with respectable dowries. For Anne, Richard chose Thomas Howard, eldest son of the Earl of Surrey, heir to the dukedom of Norfolk. The match was politically advantageous. The Howards had risen under Richard, and by binding them to Edward IV's daughter, Richard showed them unusual favor. A contract was agreed in 1485, but Bosworth intervened before it could be carried out. The plan wasn't abandoned, though. After Henry's victory, Elizabeth of York, now queen, revived the marriage for her younger sister. By then, Anne and Thomas had known each other for years. The Howard men had long served at Edward's court. But first, the Howards had to show that they were loyal and get rid of any suspicion that was on them. So the wedding between Anne and Thomas didn't actually happen until 1495. The royal family attended, but Anne's promised dowry of 10,000 marks set aside by Edward IV was never delivered. Instead, Elizabeth of York arranged for her sister to receive an annuity of £120 a year, plus an additional £26 from the crown. These payments were designed to ensure her independence and maintain her household, which included servants and horses, since the Howards' estates were diminished after Bosworth, and Thomas's father had yet to recover the dukedom of Norfolk. Now, the marriage was not a happy one. Thomas was unfaithful, openly conducting affairs with Anne's lady-in-waiting, for example, Bess Holland. Worse still, all of Anne's children died young. Records suggest as many as 4, including a son named Thomas, who lived long enough to be christened but died in 1508. Anne's health was poor, and she faded from court life after the death of her sister Elizabeth. She died in November of 1511, only 36 years old. First, she was buried at Thetford Priory, and she was later reinterred at Framlingham alongside her husband, who by then had become the powerful 3rd Duke of Norfolk. Hey, quick reminder, the Privy Council Early Bird Special for TudorCon from Home ends on August 31st, just 4 days away, or 3, depending on when you're listening to this. If you've been thinking about joining us online for a weekend of talks, music, and Tudor fun and community, now is the time to grab your ticket and get the Privy Council perks. englandcast.com/TudorCon from home for all of the deets. A big part of TudorCon from home is the community. We're going to have an online game night next week. The first one is next Wednesday. So you can hop into that, start to make your new Tudor best friends, and get ready for this amazing weekend that's coming up in just over a month. October 3rd through 5th is TudorCon. All right, englandcast.com/TudorCon from home for all the details, and don't miss out. Next up, Catherine. Born in 1479, one of the younger daughters of Edward and Elizabeth. By the time she reached marriageable age, her family's fortunes had been reshaped by the Tudors. Unlike her elder sisters, who had once been treated as glittering dynastic prizes, Catherine's marriage was more modest, though it would have long-reaching consequences for Tudor politics. In 1495, she married William Courtenay, heir to the earldom of Devon. The Courtenays were a powerful family with deep roots in the West Country and a descent that tied them distantly to the royal house of Lancaster. The match was respectable, but definitely not on the scale of a foreign prince that Edward IV might have envisioned for his daughters. But it placed Catherine securely among the English nobility and linked her Yorkist bloodline to one of the kingdom's most influential regional households. Her husband's career, however, was turbulent, which might be an understatement. Courtenay was implicated in the Perkin-Warbeck conspiracy in the 1490s, which sought to place a Yorkist pretender on the throne in the name of Edward IV's lost son. Though his role was murky, suspicion lingered. Later, in 1504, he was imprisoned in the Tower on charges of treason, accused of plotting against Henry VII. Catherine, though untouched by the charges, saw her husband disgraced and their estates seized. After Henry VII's death in 1509, the young Henry VIII released Courtenay, restored him to favor, and elevated him as the Earl of Devon. It was a dramatic reversal that once again made Catherine's household one of the great magnet families of the realm. William died just a few years later, though, in 1511, but their children carried forward the Yorkist connection. Their eldest son, Henry Courtenay, became Marquess of Exeter and one of the closest companions of Henry VIII in his early reign. He was even named a Knight of the Garter in 1511, which was a big mark of royal favor. But this intimacy did not protect him in the long run. By the 1530s, with Henry VIII increasingly suspicious of Yorkist bloodlines, Henry Courtenay was accused of treason and executed in 1539 during what is known as the Exeter conspiracy. Through him, Catherine's bloodline once again became entangled with the specter of Yorkist legitimacy, a reminder that even decades after Bosworth, the descendants of Edward IV could still be perceived as threats. Catherine herself lived until 1527, outliving her husband by more than 15 years. She saw her children grow into the Tudor world, though not without danger. Her marriage had begun as a relatively quiet match into a noble family, but its legacy proved politically explosive. Through Catherine, the Courtenays would carry Yorkist blood straight into the dangerous heart of Tudor politics. Then we have Bridget, the youngest daughter. She was born in November 1480 at Eltham Palace. Unlike her elder sisters, whose lives, like we said, were tied up in dynastic marriage negotiations, her future was set apart almost from the beginning. She was just 2 when her father died and her family's fortunes collapsed. Growing up in the shadow of sanctuary and political upheaval, she was the only one of the York princesses destined not for marriage but for religion. By the age of 10, Bridget was placed at Dartford Priory in Kent, the only house of the Dominican nuns in England. It was an elite convent, wealthy and respected, where noble daughters were often sent, sometimes out of piety, but often for politics too. Bridget took vows there and lived the rest of her life within the priory's walls. Unlike her sisters Elizabeth, Cecily, Anne, and Catherine, she was removed from the intrigues of court and dynastic marriages, but her placement was still significant. Sending a royal daughter into the cloister not only advertised the family's piety, it also quietly solved the problem of an extra princess, whose marriage might create political complications. In Bridget's case, her Yorkist blood was thus safely enclosed, away from any foreign match that might threaten Tudor stability. We know little of Bridget's day-to-day life. Records suggest that she was, of course, a valued member of the community, respected for her birth and her connections, but she did not play a wider political role. She never became abbess or anything like that. She did remain there until her death in 1517, age 37. She was buried in the priory grounds, though with the dissolution of Dartford under Henry VIII, her remains were likely lost. Bridget of York's story is quieter than those of her sisters, but it shows an important reality. Not every royal daughter became a queen or a duchess. Some were steered into religious life where they could embody piety and devotion while posing no threat to the throne. Then we have Mary of York. She was the second daughter of Edward and Elizabeth. She was born in 1467. Like her elder sister Elizabeth, she grew up in the secure early years of her father's reign, when the Yorkist dynasty seemed unshakable. She was well provided for, and as a princess, her future would almost certainly have involved a politically valuable marriage. But she did not live long enough to play any role in dynastic politics. In May of 1482, when she was just 14, she died suddenly at Greenwich Palace. The cause was not recorded, though illness was the most common fate for children and teenagers, even in royal households. Her death was a blow to her family. She was the first of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville's children to die after infancy. She was buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, one of the first of her siblings interred there. Her tomb was marked with a small brass plate, and it lay close to the resting place of her father, eventually when he passed, Edward IV. Though her life was brief and left little trace in the records, she mattered to her family, and she was a princess of York, and her death showed that even in royal households, survival into adulthood was never guaranteed. The daughters of Edward and Elizabeth lived very different lives, but together they carried Yorkist blood far beyond the disappearance of their brothers in the Tower. Elizabeth of York secured the Tudor dynasty itself. Her marriage to Henry VII joined the houses of York and Lancaster, and her children became the kings and queens of England and Scotland. Cecily, once nearly a queen of Scotland herself, slipped into obscurity in rural Lincolnshire, but her story shows how tightly the Tudors controlled Yorkist marriages to prevent rival claims. Anne's marriage to Thomas Howard linked Edward IV's line with the Howards, a dynasty that would dominate Tudor politics for the next century. Catherine, through her marriage to William Courtenay, became ancestress of the Courtenays of Exeter, a line that would rise up under Henry VIII before being cut down in suspicion of Yorkist loyalties. And Bridget, set apart at the cloister at Dartford, embodied a different sort of dynastic solution: piety and removal from politics. And Mary, who died at 14, reminds us just how dangerous even royal childhoods could be. What unites them all is survival. Their brothers' lives ended in mystery, but the sisters who lived, they lived on, sometimes at court, sometimes in obscurity, sometimes behind convent walls. Each was shaped by the tenuous legacy of their father's throne. Some, like Elizabeth and Catherine, left Yorkist descendants. Others left no children, but their marriages and alliances still mattered in the careful balancing act of Henry VII's reign. By the time of Henry VIII, the Yorkist daughters were no longer living figures, but memories woven into dynasties, into Howard ambition, into Tudor legitimacy. Through them, the Yorkist line did not completely vanish with the princes in the Tower. It lived on, reshaped and repurposed through the women whose stories are often too overshadowed by the mystery of their brothers. So we will leave it there for now, my friend, these daughters of Edward and Elizabeth. I hope you enjoyed this. Again, a reminder, englandcast.com/TudorCon from home to grab your TudorCon from home ticket. The early bird special ends on August 31st, just a couple of days away. Remember, you can get in touch with me, leave a comment wherever you're listening to this, or you can join me in the Tudor Learning Circle, the free social network just for Tudor nerds, tudorlearningscircle.com. All right, my friend, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for being here. I hope you have an amazing week. I will be back very soon.
Blow, northern wind, send for Mary sweating. Blow, northern wind, blow, blow, blow. sich hote bord in boude briekt, dat solis semlis on siegt, mensvol meide